I remember that first ride into the valley in '65. The Huey's rotors beating so hard overhead, it felt like they were shaking the courage out of my chest. I had my map board pressed to my flak jacket, grease pencil in one hand, radio handset coiled around my arm. On paper, I was a fresh artillery forward observer, trained and ready. Sitting in the back with a row of grunts who'd already seen more than I had, I felt more like a kid who'd wandered onto the wrong bus into the wrong part of town. One of them tapped my boot. "Hey, LT, you got the big guns on speed dial, right? 'Cause we're riding into Indian country." A few short laughs, then silence. The kind of silence where everybody's listening to the engine and pretending not to think about what's under that green carpet down there. I stared down at my map so they wouldn't see how tight my jaw was. The valley ahead was just grid squares and contour lines, neat circles for pre-planned targets, safety distances scribbled in the margins. Battery Alpha sat miles away with tubes laid and rounds stacked, waiting for my voice. In school, they said that was control. You read a grid, they drop steel there. Problem solved. Nobody mentioned that sometimes the there is uncomfortably close to here. The company commander sat by the open door, one hand on the frame, watching the jungle roll past like he was checking out scenery on a Sunday drive. He leaned in so I could hear him over the engine. "You just keep the rounds close, Lieutenant. We'll take care of the rest." Close sounded reasonable then, like there'd always be a little space between us and whatever I called in. The radio in my lap hissed. Another unit up north, light contact, a couple wounded, pulling back. Higher came on, smooth and calm, calling it probing attacks. Probing. Like somebody poking at us with a stick instead of rifles. I looked past his shoulder at dark jungle, pale patches of grass, a muddy line of river cutting through the highlands. On my map it was just a name and too many question marks. The crew chief suddenly pointed and chopped his hand down, and the Huey dipped toward a small clearing ringed by trees. The skids hit hard, bounced once. "Go, go, go!" the door gunner yelled, and we spilled into heat and dust. Rotor wash shoved the grass flat, threw grit in our faces. I followed the CO's hand signals, clutching my radio and board. From ground level, the clearing felt smaller, the tree line closer, the shadows under it too still, like a crowd holding its breath. Men fanned out, took knees, sighted into the dark green wall. I dropped to one knee, set the map on my thigh, and tried to weld the world in front of me to the one on paper. Compass, landmarks, grid, turning fear into numbers, just like they'd taught us. Battery Alpha checked in, calm and distant in my ear. "FO, this is Alpha, ready to receive mission." Just hearing it steadied me a little. Then the net crackled again from up north. Heavier contact now, voices strained and breathless. Higher still called it expected resistance. I stared at that dark smear of tree line, at the simple symbol on my map that just meant forest. Out here it felt more like the lip of a mouth getting ready to close. I traced one grid square with my pencil, as if that could pin it down. Looking at that map, I still believed the lines and numbers meant control. I had no idea how fast they'd turn into guesswork and prayers. Morning came to that clearing without much ceremony. Just a little less darkness and a lot more sweat. The mist burned off the grass, and suddenly we were just a bunch of shapes in shallow holes, watching the tree line like it might blink. The first patrols stepped off not long after sunrise, moving out in staggered files, grass slapping at their knees. I watched them go, trying to fix their routes in my head. One squad pushing north toward a dry creek bed, another swinging west to feel out the tree line. The radio on my hip crackled with their voices, low, professional, almost bored. Then, out of nowhere, the board turned into sharp. Short bursts of M16 fire, somebody yelling, "Contact front!" And then, quiet. Not the all-clear kind of quiet, the kind where your brain leans forward, waiting to hear who talks next. They came back in ones and twos, a little faster than they'd left. Nobody said much. A sergeant just jerked his thumb toward the jungle and muttered, "They're out there, LT, just watching." By mid-morning, the net was busier. Other companies checking in, took some fire, movement in the trees, maybe 20, maybe more. One voice, a captain, mentioned uniforms, web gear, radios. That word hung in my head. Radios. Not just local guerrillas with worn-out rifles. We were brushing up against regulars who knew how to coordinate. The battalion net still sounded calm, but underneath it you could hear something coiling tighter. When my turn finally came, when somebody out on the flank said they had muzzle flashes in a tree line to the west, my thumb hit the transmit switch before I even had time to think about being scared. "Adjust fire, over." The words felt strange in my mouth at first, like lines from a play. Grid, direction, corrections. A spotting round whistled in from miles away and bloomed against the trees in a dirty white puff. I watched it, made myself breathe, then called the adjustment. When the battery answered, "Fire for effect," I felt it in my bones before I heard it. Distant thumps, then the valley's horizon flickering. The tree line erupted in smoke and splinters, and dark shapes flung around like rag dolls. For a heartbeat, the whole perimeter seemed to exhale. Someone behind me whooped. Someone else slapped my helmet. "That's some good work, LT!" For a few minutes, I almost believed it was going to go like the training films. The first incoming mortar landed with an ugly, flat whoomp that didn't sound like our own guns at all. It was off the edge of the LZ, kicked up dirt and fragments, made a couple guys hit the deck out of reflex. The second one walked in closer. By the third, everybody was flat, helmets pulled down, waiting for the pattern. They weren't just lobbing these things either. They were walking them in, feeling their way toward the center like a blind man with a cane. Automatic fire picked up from 2, 3 directions at once. Short, disciplined bursts, not the wild spraying we'd been warned about. Men started shouting for medics. A kid digging his foxhole 2 positions over slumped sideways, shovel still in his hands. The radio, my radio, started to sound like it was tearing itself apart. One flank was under heavy pressure. Another platoon was pinned and low on ammo. A company off to our east was losing contact with one of its squads entirely. A medevac bird tried to come in and immediately took fire, tracers reaching up for it like claws. They waved it off, and the wounded who'd started to move toward the LZ just lay there in the grass, caught between hope and cover. I flipped between nets, trying to sort the voices from the noise. Requests for fire, situation reports, somebody screaming coordinates over someone else's call for a corpsman. What scared me most wasn't the volume, it was the pattern underneath. All these separate threads pointing toward the same thing. They weren't just shooting and scooting. They were pushing on our edges, finding seams, bending us inward. Somewhere between those calm calls for fire and the raw screams for medevac, it hit me like a hand on the back of the neck. We weren't pushing into their valley at all. We were already standing dead center in their trap. By midday, the perimeter felt like it was closing in on us. The little scrape I called a foxhole suddenly seemed too shallow, the distance to the trees way too short. My map board was a wreck, pencil lines smeared, sweat stains, dirt ground into the paper. All those neat, pre-planned targets I'd drawn meant nothing now. The enemy wasn't where the circles were. They were where the blank spaces were. Every time I erased and redrew, it felt less like planning and more like guessing. The company commander slid into my hole, rounds cracking overhead, dirt trickling down between us. He watched the tree line for a second, then looked straight at me. "We need it closer, Lieutenant. They're right on top of us." It hit like a stone in my gut. Training films started rolling in my head. Minimum safe distances, blast radii, all the red underlined "never do this" pages. The book was very clear about how close was too close. The valley didn't seem to care. Out there, mortar rounds were walking toward the center of the LZ like they had our position written down. I keyed the handset. "Adjust fire, over." The battery answered calm and steady. So far away they might as well have been on another planet. I gave them the grid, then stared at the map. The distance between our line and where I needed those rounds wasn't enough. Not by the book. Another shell landed closer. A man cried out somewhere down the line. My thumb pressed the switch before I could talk myself out of it. "Drop 100. Fire for effect." The moment I said it, I heard their guns in my ear, faint but real, and this cold thought slid in. If I'm wrong, I'm not just hitting them. I'm hitting us. The impacts came in like the sky caving. The ground kicked under me. Dust and splinters rained into the hole. Men shouted along the perimeter, some cursing, some cheering. "That's it, LT! Keep it on 'em! Jesus, they're dropping it on our heads!" When the last blast rolled away, I crawled up and peeked out. The tree line was torn open, dark shapes down in the brush. But then I saw one of ours clutching his leg, blood spreading through his pants at an angle that made no sense. Enemy round? Our shrapnel? From where I lay, I couldn't tell. He kept groaning. "What the hell hit me?" And I felt something catch behind my ribs. That was the first time I really believed the damage on my map might include my own men. The battalion net crackled. "FO, how close can you bring it?" I knew what they wanted, closer than I wanted to say. On paper, the distances still made sense, all tidy in their tables. Down in the dirt, with the ground shaking and our own guys bleeding, it didn't feel like math anymore. It felt like I'd put my hand on the barrel and pulled the trigger myself. It started like a storm you could hear before you saw it. At first, there were just more shots in the tree line, more shadows moving where shadows shouldn't. Then the whistles started. High, thin sounds cutting over the gunfire, followed by a bugle that made the hairs on my neck stand up. The NVA didn't just come. They arrived. The whole jungle seemed to lean toward us. Our line lit up, M16s snapping, machine guns rattling until barrels glowed. I could see them now between the trees. Flashes of dark uniforms weaving through the trunks, closing the last bit of distance like they'd done this 100 times before. Grenades arced both ways, little black eggs disappearing into holes and brush. One went off close enough that I felt the heat on my face. Men were screaming, not in panic, but in that raw, animal way people do when metal hits flesh. Somewhere off to the right, where one of our flanks was supposed to be solid, the firing faltered, then thinned. "They're in the wire!" somebody yelled, even though we didn't have wire, just hasty holes and willpower. Radios that had been noisy all day went strange. Half the operators were down, and what was left were overlapping calls, cut-off grids, someone sobbing into a handset. Every report I could make out said the same thing in different words. "We're not holding." I saw the captain crawling toward my foxhole through the dust and debris, helmet gone, face streaked with sweat and dirt. He slid in beside me, bullets cracking overhead, and glanced out at the line sagging under the weight of that assault. Then he looked at me. Really looked at me. "Can you stop them?" It wasn't an order. It was a question that shoved everything in my brain into a tight, burning knot. If that flank folded, they'd roll us up like a rug. The LZ, the birds, the wounded in the grass, gone. I stared at the map, at the little blue mark that was our position, at the grid line running right through our own coordinates. All the safe distance tables, all the diagrams from school evaporated. There was only one thing left that wasn't guesswork. If I dropped it here, right on us, I might break the attack. or I might finish the job for them. My hand shook when I keyed the handset, so I dug my elbow into the dirt to steady it. Fire mission. Danger close. Over. The battery came back, businesslike, not knowing what my world looked like. I read the grid, and for the first time that day, I heard my own voice crack just a little. I was giving them our location. I heard a couple of guys nearby go quiet, eyes on me instead of the trees, like they half understood what that meant. The captain's jaw was clenched so tight his neck shook, but he didn't say no. I added the last piece with a mouth that felt full of sand. Fire for effect. The seconds after that lasted longer than some weeks I've lived. The enemy were still coming, shapes now at spitting distance, muzzle flashes blinding in the shadows. I could hear one of our machine gunners screaming as he fired, voice hoarse and high. Then, very faint over the radio, the sound of our guns going off miles away. I remember thinking, in this weird, calm place in the middle of everything, that if I was wrong, nobody would live long enough to tell me. When the barrage finally stopped, it was like somebody had hit mute on the whole valley. No more bugles, no more whistles. Just the ringing in my ears and a few stubborn bursts of gunfire tapering off into nothing. Smoke hung low over the clearing, little fires licking at shredded grass and broken branches. The air tasted like dust and burned powder. For a second I just lay at the bottom of my hole, fingers dug into the dirt, waiting to find out if I was still alive. Then I realized I could feel my hands, my feet, the thud of my own heart. That almost surprised me. I forced myself up, inch by inch, until my eyes cleared the rim of the foxhole. The perimeter looked like somebody had taken a giant hand and dragged it through our line. Parts of the tree line were just gone, ripped open into splintered stumps and craters. Dark shapes in enemy uniforms lay twisted where the blasts had caught them mid-charge, rifles flung yards away. That should have made me feel something like relief. It didn't, because scattered among them were our own pieces. American helmets lying on their sides, familiar boots sticking out from under torn ponchos, flak jackets in colors I knew from the bird ride-in. I climbed out, legs shaking, and started moving along what passed for our line. Medics were already at work, sliding between holes, hands slick with blood and dust. "He's gone! Move on!" "Stay with me, kid. Stay with me." Some guys were sitting up, blank-eyed, checking themselves for holes like they didn't quite trust the answer. Others weren't moving at all. I couldn't help counting. 1, 2, 3. Then I stopped, because I didn't know which number belonged to them and which might belong to me. A sergeant I half knew staggered over and clapped my shoulder hard enough to make me stumble. "You did it, LT. You stopped him. You saved our asses." He moved on before I could answer. A few steps later, another man brushed past, not meeting my eyes. Those shells were too damn close. He didn't say more, but he didn't have to. The words stuck like shrapnel. Medevac birds started coming in, skimming the treetops, taking the occasional crack of small arms fire as they flared. We loaded the wounded on stretchers, some biting down on bandages, some begging not to be left, some so quiet it scared me more than the screaming. The rotor wash turned the LZ into a snow globe of ash and paper and dust. Every time we carried another stretcher out, I wondered if a fragment from my fire mission was inside that body. Later, at some point that evening, I sat with my map board again and filled out the report. Grid coordinates, number of rounds fired, type of shells, estimated enemy KIA. There wasn't a box for friendly maybe. No neat space where I could write, "I think I hit us too." So I didn't. I just wrote what the form asked for. That night, I lay in a shallow, half-collapsed hole and stared up at the slice of sky I could see between the trees. The guns were quiet, The only sound was the ringing in my ears and the occasional cough from someone who'd made it through the day. I traced the trajectory of every round in my mind, over and over, trying to decide if I'd been brave or just lucky in the worst possible way. On the forms, I wrote, "Mission successful." In my head, I kept seeing the same blast again and again, and wondering who paid for it. The next time I saw that valley, I needed a walking stick to get across it. 40, 50 years will do that to you. The jungle had grown back, thicker in some places, thinner in others. The guide, a kid really, couldn't have been more than 30, was talking into a little microphone, explaining to us what had happened there. "Decisive fire support," he said. "Courage under fire. A turning point in the engagement." The words floated over the grass and bounced off the trees like they were describing someone else's life. I let the rest of the group drift ahead. The ground under my boots felt familiar in a way my old knees didn't like. I stopped where the clearing ought to have been, or close enough, and poked the dirt with the tip of my stick. No blast craters anymore, just roots and red earth. I bent down, slow and careful, and touched the soil with my hand. It was warm. For a second, the rotors were in my ears again, and there were young men all around me instead of tourists in sun hats. Names came back that the guide didn't mention, because they weren't in his notes. The medic who kept rolling toward the wounded even when the mortars bracketed the LZ. The machine gunner who laughed as he fired because he was too scared to do anything else. And one kid in particular, freckle-faced, too small for his gear, who'd tapped my boot on the helicopter and asked if I had the big guns on speed dial. I can still hear his voice. I remember the way his dog tags felt in my hand later, slick with mud and something else, as we bagged him up with the others. His name is on one of those walls back home, carved into polished stone. I've traced it with my finger more times than I can count. The war didn't end for me when I rotated home. It came back in pieces, in the way a slammed door sounded too much like incoming, in the way thunderstorms turned into distant artillery at 3 a.m. Marriages strained under silences I couldn't really explain. Sleep never stayed long. People called it nerves, or later they called it something with letters. I just called it the valley, still echoing. I've spent a lot of years doing math in my head. How many men did that fire mission save? How many might it have taken? The truth is, I don't know the exact balance. I can guess, I can argue with myself, but I will never really know. What I do know is this. If I hadn't made that call, if I'd frozen or played it safe, that whole company might have stayed in this dirt forever. This place could have been a neat line in a book. Unit destroyed in the valley. I'm not telling you this because I want forgiveness. I don't think anyone can give that to me. I'm telling you because it's the truth I've carried longer than my rifle. People say I was brave that day. Truth is, I was just more afraid of what would happen if I stayed silent. The valley kept its secrets, but I still hear the guns every night. If you've made it this far, thank you. These stories take time to tell, and even longer to understand. You've just walked through the memories of men who were never supposed to be remembered. If their voices meant something to you, if even one line stayed behind when the sound faded, don't let it disappear. Give this video a like, share it with someone who still believes history belongs to the living, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next story. Every episode here is another page, another life, another truth pulled out of the smoke. Drop a comment too, not for the algorithm, but for the conversation. Tell me what you felt, or what you remember hearing from your own fathers, grandfathers, uncles, or friends. That's how these memories stay alive. Subscribe, stay with us, and let's keep turning the pages together.